he didn't have a chance. He comes from a great family. His grandfather, a doctor in Mobile. I've been at the old Sledge mansion in Mobile, and I've been at your aunt's mansion there in Selma. And he is history. He is Alabama history. He didn't have a chance. He had to write about Alabama history. His whole family was involved in it. He was always right there following around with his dad. I'm proud to present John Sledge. Talk to him, John.
I can tell you. Jim, by the way, is a war hero. He won't tell you that, but I will. And it's an honor to have him in the room. We all, in fact, Jim, I think we should all applaud you. And thank you all for coming out. It's a nice afternoon. You certainly could have been doing lots of other things. I'm honored that you would do this. Anyway, what I thought I would do is talk about some of the women that inspired my interest in history. As Jim said, I really didn't have a chance, and I want to introduce you to some of the characters beside my father that were responsible for that. And the occasion for Alabama's 200th birthday really provided the ideal opportunity to write about the Civil War experience in the state. I met with Jay Lamar, who's with the Alabama Bicentennial Commission, and she said one of the things she wanted to do was sponsor books about Alabama history. And I said, well, I'd love to write just a layperson's history of the Civil War in the state, concentrating on the action, because I felt that had been underrepresented. And so she was kind enough to sponsor it. This is from the cover. It's Wilson's Charge. This is an incident from the Battle of Selma. It's a fairly modern painting. It's from the 1990s, but I liked it because I think it conveys the Confederate experience, essentially being run over roughshod by the Federals during the war, but also sort of the harem-scarum quality of what armed combat was like in the Civil War. We'll start with my grandmother. She was born in 1894 and died in 1986, and lived most of her life in Mobile. This is on my father's side. And all through my childhood, as Jim mentioned, we would go down to her home on Spring Hill Avenue called Georgia Cottage, and that's where we spent holidays and Christmas, and I had vivid memories. We'd pull in there, and the car wheels would be crunching on gravel, and we'd pull in front of the house, and my grandmother would come out on the front porch, and she'd go, Jean, that was my mother's name, and I would sort of watch my mother tense up as she got ready for this visit. And as a child, I fortunately missed a lot of that, but Gran was a terrific storyteller. She had a fascination of the past and its figures and characters, and was a great listener as well. And so all during her youth, she had talked to people who had participated in the Civil War and who had either been in battles as soldiers or had been civilians and suffered under the blockade, or whom had been slaves, or even free blacks in the case of some individuals in Mobile. And unlike a lot of those people's families who would roll their eyes at, when Gramps got garrulous, she would listen and then pass those tales on to a wide-eyed boy. And Augusta Evans Wilson lived in this house during the war. That's her on the lower right. Augusta Jane Evans before she married. And so the house was really redolent of history because Gran had collected all these first edition copies of her books and kept them in the house. She was an autodidact, that is, she was self-taught, and wrote these very turgid Victorian novels that aren't much read today, but they were incredibly popular back during the war and immediately after. In fact, she was the first American woman to make over $100,000 from her writings. She fell in love with her agent in New York City before the war, and being an ardent pro-Confederate, she spurned his advances, and then the war came. He banked all of her royalty, but nonetheless, her spirit was manifest in this home, and that's where she wrote several of her books, including a Civil War novel called Macaria, or The Altars of Sacrifice, which was published in 1863. The novel was forbidden by Northern High Command to be read among their troops, and in the South, the editions had actually, some of the pages were wallpaper because of the difficulty of getting supplies with the blockade. So in this front left parlor was Gran's bedroom, and she had a coal fireplace. Now, I know I'm in coal country. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced a coal fire. We're told that coal is the future, so you're likely going to. It's the most wonderful heat in the world. It's bone penetrating and cozy, and I would sit on this big bolster in front of that coal fire and just hear Gran tell these elaborate tales. And top left, hopefully this will establish some of my bona fides. This is a sketch of the CSS Alabama that I did now 50 years ago, which gives me some pause. But Gran was amazing. I began to realize as I got a little older that she was guilty of embellishing the truth. But that really didn't matter. It was all about her mellifluous voice and storytelling. But the most dramatic example of this embellishment came when I was about 10. I got really interested in the Alamo. And so Gran gave me what she said was a powder flask from the siege of the Alamo. And I went running up to Dad and I said, Dad, this is a powder flask from the siege of the Alamo. And he goes, hell, that's a GI oil can like I carried in Pacific. After the war, a Confederate politico and general named Robert Toombs was on the run, like a lot of Confederate politicians and high commanders. They're trying to escape federal prosecution. And he hid out with Miss Gusta. So when he would be in the front parlor with his little teacup on his lap and Yankee patrols would come by, he would swiftly hand her the teacup and scoot down into the basement. Battle of Mobile Bay was one of the most significant conflicts to take place in this state. And this was a painting from the 1880s called An August Morning with Farragut. We see Farragut perched in the rigging at the upper right. He was a Southerner himself. He's leaning out over the fearsome casemate of the Tennessee as the Hartford, the men on the Hartford, battle it out with this Confederate ironclad. We'd also go to the battlefield at Blakely. Now there's a state park there. If you haven't visited, I urge you to go. It's an incredible sight there. Indian mounds. There's a historic abandoned town that was a county seat in the 18-teens. And then all these Civil War earthworks and just these beautiful live oaks. Really a spectacular place. But that was the site of the last really major battle in Alabama. It took place 9 hours after Robert E. Lee surrendered in distant Virginia. So it was really a needless battle. The other figure in my childhood was my aunt. This was Gran's sister, Octavia Sturdivant Wynn, O.S. Wynn. We called her Tay-Tay for short. Here she is with a glue pot at the Selma Times-Journal in 1957. And beginning in the teens, she had been a city editor for the Selma Times-Journal. Wrote a column for years called Up and Down the Town. Knew everybody in the Black Belt. Every time somebody found a cache of silver in the stump of an oak tree or something, she would be out there to interview people that remembered all of the details. She was a voracious reader. She loved Faulkner and his novels. And in fact, Catherine Tucker Wyndham, who some of you will know is Alabama's famed storyteller, was also from Selma. They both worked at the Times-Journal for a number of years. Was a child of depression, so she didn't throw anything away. As Dad said, if she smoked, she would have saved her cigarette butts. When she passed, we went to her house and had to sort of dispose of everything, and I guess I was a young teen by that time. And dare not throw it away without going through every piece of paper, because in one case, there was a $20 gold piece at the bottom of one of these shoe boxes. And in another, there was a letter from Zelda Fitzgerald, a handwritten letter, apologizing for her drunken behavior at some social function. From the depths of my polluted soul, Zelda, with this elaborate Z. So Tay-Tay was just fascinating, and the most memorable experience with her involved stories from Wilson's Raid, because that was really the axis of her Civil War interests. And about that directly impacted Jasper and this part of Alabama. That's James Harrison Wilson on the left. He was only 26, one of the youngest generals to wear the Union blue. But he has those hardened features typical of young men inured to service in all weathers at that time. He was a crack organizer and an expert in the use of cavalry. And he had a large force, like 13,000 men, and they came down from the Tennessee River really without opposition until they got to about Jasper. They were trying to wreck Alabama's industrial capacity So they were burning collieries and foundries and wrecking any kind of war-making potential the state had left. Opposing him on the right was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was 44 years old at the time, a former slave trader, a Memphis City alderman, completely unlettered, but a military genius, self-taught, and really very formidable in the field. Forrest always said that, victory would go to whoever got there first with the most. And unfortunately, facing Wilson, he only had a few thousand men, and they were scattered and exhausted and demoralized. And he had to try to concentrate them to stop this thunderbolt. Tay was fascinated by the story of what happened at Selma and Wilson's raid. And the most vivid recollection I have is when I was, again, about 10, she came up to visit us in Montevallo for a weekend, and then afterwards we all piled in the car to take her home. It's about an hour drive. And as my mother said, it was a non-stop account from door to door, Tay on Wilson's raid. We crossed the viaduct over Shoal Creek, and there were two big magnolias there, and she said, that's where General Wilson tied his gray gelding Sheridan and consulted with his officers about where to go next, how to get to Briarfield and destroy the naval works and so forth. Dad, being more skeptical, said, well, if those were the trees, they would have been saplings in 1865, not likely to hold a spirited gelding. Didn't matter to me. It was about story and delivery, and Tay was an expert. South of Montevallo, a little town called Ashby, the railroad track curves across the road and then goes arrow straight for Selma the rest of the way. This was essentially the route the Union Raiders took once they got to Montevallo. It was the old Alabama and Tennessee River Railroad. And Forrest by this time had his forces somewhat marshaled, and he was trying to gather them for a stand. And the High Command sent an ordnance train up from Selma to support him. And it was carrying ammunition and supplies, and it just had a few cars, and it was pointed north. And as the raid proceeded, this train had to sort of chuff and reverse along with Confederates. And as one Southern later said, I'm confident the Yankees drove us 15 miles an hour most of the time. Well, it turned out that Tay had known the man who had been the engineer on this train. He had been 18 years old and had a new wife and baby down in Selma that he was worried about. And he had later written a memoir, but he had lived in Selma, and so Tay had interviewed him and talked to him. And so she was able to tell these incredible stories about this guy on this ordnance train. How his firemen tried to jump off the train when the raiders came into view, and the engineer had to threaten him with a big hammer. So Tay was a master at making all of that come to life. Then we get to Selma. We go look at the St. James Hotel and the Alabama River and the Pettus Bridge. And then we go to Sturdivant Hall, which is a nice antebellum mansion there. We go up into the cupola. Tay was a docent, so she had carte blanche to go anywhere. And we climb up these steps, and they'd be creaking. She'd be out of breath. And then we get to the top, and you look out over Selma, these beautiful green trees and well-tended flowers and houses. And listening to Tay's voice, all of that sort of faded away to be replaced by this apocalyptic vision of swirling smoke and dust and glistening bayonets and horses running and people pell-mell, and just this incredible battle in front of the family who was watching from the cupola, and then the retreat engulfing the house, and then the Yankee troopers coming in, the servants yelling, the Yankees are coming, the Yankees are coming. Before anybody has time to draw breath, the troopers come thundering into the house, up and down the stairs, into the bedrooms, ransacking the drawers, looking for anything of value, shooting dogs, chickens in the backyard, complete and utter chaos. And it's all happening just as it's getting dark. A blood-red sun is going down, and smoke is obscuring everything. And animals are dead in intersections, and wagons are broken, and it's the end of the world. For some. For others, it's the beginning of a new world, because of all of the slaves in Selma are all of a sudden automatically free. And many of them actually enlist in the Union Army as soldiers. So now they actually can have firearms and fight against the institution that's held them in bonds for so long. So again, Tay could convey all of that just so beautifully. So what I wanted to do was try to write a book that was inspired by this sense of the immediacy of the past. You know, Faulkner wrote, "The past isn't dead, it's not even past." I told that to my daughter, so now she refers to me as yesterday's man. That's okay. Anyway, so what I do in the book is I have a prologue about Tay-Tay and some of that, and then we move into the actual experience of the war in the state. We talk about secession. Many of you, no doubt, have been to the state capitol in Montgomery and seen the gold star inlaid on the portico where Jefferson Davis took the oath of office. Here's an etching of it on the right. On the left is Viola Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, a Mississippi Belle, who enlivened Montgomery's social scene. So Montgomery's the capital of the Confederacy until like May or June of 1861. And then, you know, all the politicians' wives are bored with Montgomery. It's dusty, the mosquitoes are bad, it's hot, and there's not a lot of entertainment, and the restaurants are terrible. So there are other reasons to move the capital, but those were good ones. And they moved to Richmond, and of course that really became the center of where most of the fighting would be in the war. This is a scene from near Florence and the Tennessee River. These came down after the fall of Fort Henry in the winter of '62 and brought the war into North Alabama for the first time. So I'll write about that. The Straits Raid through North Alabama, the story of Emma Sansom. This is her monument in Gadsden, and that's Colonel Strait on the left. He was in his 30s, committed abolitionist. He was sort of frustrated with the slow pace of the war. Nothing was happening at the time. It was in the summer of '63, before Gettysburg and all that. And he decided that if he took a troop of cavalry through North Alabama into North Georgia, he could cut the railroad north of Atlanta, say at Rome, and Bragg's Confederates were in Tennessee and Kentucky, and it would deprive them of much needed supplies and force them to retreat. His commanding general said, great idea. But then he started changing the plans. Turned out he gave him infantrymen instead of cavalrymen. So Midwestern farm boys, basically. And then he gave him mules instead of horses. And they turned out to be inferior mules. A lot of them hadn't been broken, and they were cantankerous, as mules famously are. Faulkner said, a mule will work patiently for you 10 years for the privilege of kicking you once. And that was the experience of these boys in blue as they tried to sort of break in these mules for this raid. One soldier said as soon as we get on the mule, he'd take off on what they called a sheep gallop. Go running along, then plant its forefeet in the sand, kick up its hindquarters, and catapult the soldier over its head. Lots of bruised shoulders and broken ribs, I'm sure. And great fun for everybody that was watching this. So Strait gets underway, and mules, I'm sure many of you have been around them or seen them, they're noisy critters. They love to bray for their breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for snacks, for breaks, for who knows what reason, but all the time. So a blind, half-deaf man could have followed this host from 5 miles away, is what it amounted to. Well, they took off about 1,700 strong and were pursued again by Forrest across hill and dale, and eventually were humbled before they could get to Georgia. And Forrest had about a third as many men, but he tricked Strait into thinking he had more, and he was able to use this teenage girl to find out where a critical ford was to get across the river and defeat the Federals. I also look at a lot of the ordinary Alabamians that were sort of caught up in this insanity. On the left, we see a young soldier from Montevallo taken early in the war. It's called Jim Off to the Wars on his pony. It's the only known photograph of a mounted Alabamian from the war. And he's holding what appears to be a musket with a bayonet attached, and his right hand is bandaged. I don't know if those two facts are connected. Generally, cavalry in the Western theater during the war fought dismounted. They'd ride their horses to where they needed to go, and then they would dismount and fight. Then on the right, we see a man named Gus Askew. He was in Barber County, which is where Eufaula is today. He had been a slave during the war, had been 9 years old when the Yankees came in at the end of the war, and vividly remembered that day. How frightening those Union soldiers were with their heavy boots and their clanking accoutrements and their pistols and their knives and their rough, profane soldier's talk. But here he is in the 1930s as an old man telling a WPA interviewer about his childhood. And then, of course, the last major assault at Blakely across the bay as the Union closed the vise on Mobile at the very end of the war. This is the largest land action of the war in Alabama. 16,000 Yankee soldiers charging across this broken piney woods terrain against maybe 3,000 Confederates who were dug in. Many of these troops were freed slaves who had enlisted from Louisiana, Mississippi, and of course their incentive was that if they were recaptured, they would be re-enslaved. So certainly they were fervent for the cause and were proud to wear the Union blue. And so here's a famous image of that. General Grant was unhappy with this battle. He had tried to take Mobile at many points during the war, and other strategic considerations prevented it. And then, as he said, it finally fell when if we had just waited a few days, it would have fallen into our hands with no cost whatsoever. As it was, there were a few hundred men killed on either side. It was not like Gettysburg, but it was certainly bad enough. And then we just talk about sort of the impact that the war had on the state, the devastation, and this was what many people like Grant and Tate vividly remembered their elders talking about, the poverty in the South after the war, the lack of really any kind of economy for so many years, and how much people had to struggle. And here we see a bridge across the Tennessee that's been destroyed. Almost any kind of public property had been wrecked that the Union soldiers could get to. And by the end of the war, there were 75,000 bluecoats tramping across all different parts of Alabama. So that was not a county seat that didn't have a Union presence soon enough. And so depots, railroads, warehouses, all kinds of things like that were destroyed. And it would take Alabama many, many years to recover. But it would be perhaps the profoundest incident in our state's 200-year history, because after the Civil War, as one ex-slave said, nothing after that was ever the same. It became a different place and haunted really by what would happen here. And in many respects, we still are. We still have to understand what took place. You all been terrific presentation. I hope I haven't prattled on too long.
Oh, it was wonderful. All right. This is Margaret Lee, Special People in Places. I'm on the campus of Bevel State Community College, Walker campus. And today we have been thoroughly entertained by an author, John Sledge. John, tell us the name of your new book.
It's called These Rugged Days, Alabama and the Civil War.
Oh, we are so happy this man did this book. What a gift to the state. And everybody needs to run out and get a copy of it. Where is it available?
Well, actually, I'm told it's in Costco, so that's good news.
Yes, that
you can
is.
get it on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, those kind of sites.
Oh, wonderful. I was going to ask, but I wanted to let everybody go ahead and get their book and leave. And big mistake, I bought the last one. I almost didn't get a book.
I'm glad you got one. I appreciate that.
Did you cover anything about Wilson's raid in Walker County?
A little bit, because of course he was moving so fast, for one thing, but they got all the way to Jasper without opposition. It was really the first place that they began to encounter scattered Confederate scouts and so forth. And then there were so many, coal and iron resources around here, collieries and foundries and things like that, for them to go after, that they were very busy all around this part of the state, what's now Birmingham, Ealaton then, Montevallo, Briarfield, a lot of burning of resources and stuff. So this was a very consequential area for the state.
And now you have the photos that you had on screen in your presentation. Are those in the book?
Yes, they're all in the book.
They are wonderful.
Thank you.
I just can't wait to enjoy the book, and it's just a treasure, John. I really can't thank you enough.
Well,
it's
thank
wonderful.
you all for hosting. Jasper's charming. I had a terrific time here.
Oh,
Great
the people at
Good
Bevel
energy.
State.
Yeah,
Aren't
absolutely.
they wonderful? And Linda Lewis is incredible. We're so proud of that lady. Coleman County, did you happen to go to the Crooked Creek Museum? There's a museum.
I did not know that.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, John, you must go to that.
That's on my list.
Okay, Crooked Creek Museum. This gentleman, maybe in the 1980s, bought this property. And there again, you're talking about so much history,
Right.
Civil War history, is lost.
Yes.
And this man bought this farm and began to find these, what are they, the bullets,
Mini
musket,
balls, yeah, mini balls.
he began to find those on the property, and neighbors said, oh, in farming around there, we used to find all kinds of these things, and we threw them away.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, he began to dig into it, and it was the site of one of the battles on Crooked Creek, where Strait came through, and there's a book, Strait, about Strait's Mule Brigade.
I've read that, yeah. It was a good source, yes. Very good book.
I enjoyed it too. And this museum now is right there, and of course he has the book there.
I've heard about that museum. I think
You
I might have
have?
even gone to their website. But yeah, no, it's truly amazing what that guy's done.
Oh, it was just wonderful when he finally found out about it. What he collected there is just a beautiful museum, and we do have a program on it. So
good.
all of the programs I've done, we have over 100, on archived. And so you'll be able to go to our site and see the museum.
Wonderful.
Just wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. I
And
appreciate it.
it was just a good experience today. You
Good.
did a fantastic job.
you.
Everyone was just enjoyed it so much. And how about your old friend introducing you?
Oh, that was just such a treat. I really saw Jim Kitson in the parking lot first thing, and I didn't recognize him. It had been so long. And my mom had told me when I told her I was coming up here, she said, well, Jim Kitson's from up there. And there he is. He materialized. It just couldn't have been a better sight.
You knew he would be here.
Yeah, couldn't have been a better sight.
Oh, it's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we thank you again for your
you.
time,
Oh,
John.
sure.
Can't wait to read the book. Everyone needs to get it. And again, John, where can people get this book?
It's published by the University of Alabama Press, so they can get it from their website, or Costco has it or can get it. Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, any bookstore can order it for you, and so it should be easy to get.
Every Alabamian should have this on your bookshelf. It is wonderful. Thank you again.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.